Hi everyone, my name is Alexis Phelps and I'm on team 4 with Kai, Yumi, Kanako, Risa, Yusuke, and Kalia. We're going to be presenting to you on Brazil. And to start, we're going to talk about communication in a business setting, then in social gatherings, then in a public setting. And for each of these, we're going to give a comparison between Brazil, the US, and Japan.
So just to give you a general overview of Brazil, it is located in South America. The main language is Portuguese, and it is the largest country in both South America and Latin America. It has a population of about 211 million, which makes it the fifth most populous country in the world. And each of these things that I just listed out and told you will be something to pay attention to as we go throughout a presentation because it definitely has an impact on the different cultural aspects that we'll be talking about.
We are talking about business setting first. According to Hofstede's 6 dimensions, I am going to talk about 3 of them, which are power, distance, and individualism, and uncertainty avoidance. In terms of power distance, the score is 69, which is high. It can be said that Brazil reflects a society that believes hierarchy should be respected and inequalities are acceptable. In companies, there is one boss who takes complete responsibility. Status symbols of power are very important in order to indicate social position and communicate the respect that could be shown. In terms of individualism, the score is 38, which is low. It means that in this country, people from birth onwards are usually integrated into strong. In business, it is important to build up trustworthy and long-lasting relationships. For example, a meeting usually starts with a general conversation in order to get to know each other before doing business. The preferred communication style is context-rich, so people will often speak a lot and write in an elaborate fashion. Finally, in terms of uncertainty avoidance, the score is 76, which is high. It shows usually Brazilians are very passionate and demonstrative people. Therefore, emotions are easily shown in their body language.
Okay, so now I'm going to discuss the importance of relationship building in a business setting. As we've seen with Hofstede, Brazil is closer to a collective society than an individualistic one. This is also supported by the GlobeSmart profile, where they lean toward interdependent. This means that in the workplace, Brazilians prefer to work in teams and value group input. There's a lot of group discussion, which is often very lively. Brazilians are eager to please others or make a positive impression, and because of this, they may sometimes claim to have solutions to problems when that's not yet the case. And then another important thing to note is that Brazilians tend to follow a business as personal mindset. They view colleagues as friends and are very comfortable sharing personal information with each other. It's important to them to have a strong relationship with someone they are doing business with. As their relationships are more in-depth, they tend to grow them gradually rather than rapidly. And then mealtimes are really important in Brazil, and they have longer lunches and dinners. So this would be a great opportunity to start forming a relationship with someone you intend to do business with.
And next, I will tell you about the time in business. There are some amazing facts and about Brazilian people's value of time in business. And also, I will introduce you 3 types values of time in business. And first, it's about business meeting. Many Brazilian people tend to late for business meeting about 50 to 30 minutes behind would not be considered late. And they tend to have a lot of communication times with friends and family members. So often they cannot start business meeting on time, or they run longer than scheduled, which can lead to delays. Many Brazilian people don't think being late for company is not serious problems. It's not only about business, but also about TV shows, events, and conventions. And second one is about long telephone conversation. Many Brazilian people value having communications for a long time. So their telephone conversation will usually take more than 30 minutes because their values and personality. As I said, they tend to cherish the time of conversation with the people and like friends and family members. And last one is about absence without noticing. Many Brazilian people don't like being disturbed their time or space. So if they have meeting and that is not so important, they tend to do another things without doing task work. So there are about Brazilian people's value of time in business. And these things are just one part of Brazilian personality. So not all Brazilian people have such values. But I think if Japanese people do these things, Japanese people will be fired.
Okay, so now we'll be comparing Brazil and the US in a business setting. So, as we've talked about, Brazil has a more relaxed concept of time, meaning it's acceptable to be late and sometimes even expected. They're also more flexible with how time is used, such as meetings being less strictly organized and people interrupting to add new ideas. This is in contrast to the US, where punctuality is valued and meeting agendas tend to be more rigid. Brazilians also build strong relationships and are comfortable mixing business and personal, whereas in the US, it is more task oriented and personal relationships might develop over time, but it's not necessary in a business relationship. Because Brazilians value relationships, they prefer face to face communication or longer phone calls. In the US, someone may prefer email for the sake of time, and Americans are more comfortable emailing people they have never met before, whereas in Brazil, this wouldn't be the case. Then finally, in regard to hierarchy, the US is more egalitarian than Brazil. Brazilians aren't always as willing to counter someone else's idea or disagree with a boss as an American might be.
Next, I'm going to talk about comparison to Japan in business setting. First, there is as much hierarchy as Brazil in Japanese company. One boss has much responsibility and subordinates have to obey whatever the boss says. Second, Japanese people are strict with time compared to Brazil. A meeting in company will start exactly on time. So if someone is late to the meeting, they will be considered rude. Finally, it is same as Brazil in the aspect of being collectivism in Japan. But collectivism of Japan is like not to express their existence oneself. There is a strong pressure of cooperation in a group.
Next, we're going to talk about social gatherings. First, it is about meals in Brazil. It is considered to be on time to someone's house for dinner is kind of rude thing. And being there after 15 to 30 minutes would be good for them. And also, after having a small breakfast like bread or coffee, they often have a big meal as a lunch, such as sandwiches. And next, we're going to talk about how do they communicate with people. First, they show and share their emotions to feel comfortable when they talk with somebody. And they often have a discussions, and there's no problem to interrupt each other to share their opinions. And when they talk with somebody, they avoid eye-to-eye contact to show respect when they talk with older people or their bosses. And these days, many countries use webcams on the business, but it's not common in Brazil to use webcams. So it would be better to use email and phone call when we have a communication with Brazilians.
So compared to the United States, like we talked about before, Brazil has more of a relaxed culture. So in the United States, it's actually rude to interrupt someone during discussions. You know, I remember having me personally. I remember reading something in a book that we read for class, and it was talking about how someone was kind of off put by someone interrupting them, because in the United States, it's seen as a sign of respect to allow people to finish what they're saying, get out all their thoughts, and then to respond instead of responding in the middle of someone's response or discussion. Secondly, meals aren't prioritized in the United States. So it's customary that you'll see Americans either skipping lunch to work or sometimes even skipping dinner with their friends or family to work. And that's just because work tends to be more prioritized than meals and relationships are in the United States, unlike in Brazil, where meals are the ones that are prioritized because they're seen as forms of relationship building. Third, eye contact is very, very important in the United States. As we saw and will see, eye contact is very important when it comes to, talking with friends. But in Brazil, eye contact is typically avoided when it's someone um, of like respect. So you're like bosses or older people, but in the United States, eye contact is important throughout everyone, just because it's seen as a sign of respect and it's seen as a sign that you're listening and understanding and comprehending what someone is saying. So that's why it's typically not avoided, and we try to give eye contact all the time, because if it's not given, then it sometimes can be seen as disrespectful. And lastly, arriving on time is customary in the United States. It is actually one of my pet peeves to not arrive on time, but that's just because I'm more of a type A person. But in general, arriving 15 to 30 minutes late to an event can sometimes be seen as disrespectful or like you aren't respecting someone's time, as well as events typically start on time, whether it's like a business meeting or an event or a convention. Being on time is something that's valued in the United States.
Next is about comparison to Japan of social gatherings. First, it is about time. Usually people in Japan is arriving on time or 5 to 10 minutes earlier, even when just meeting friends. It is considered polite. This action may be affected by Japanese education style. A lot of teacher teaches that students always should be arrive and get ready 5 minutes earlier. Next is about emotion. Usually people don't express their emotions so much. Sometimes the emotions is expressed on their face, but most of the time we cannot see and guess what they think about. Lastly, it is about expression. A lot of people don't express their own opinion. Also, Japanese tends to avoid conflict. The Japanese try to argue kindly, not to stimulate others. And as a lot of Japanese people don't get to be emotional, they usually do not gesture very much while speaking.
I'm going to talk about public settings. First, let me talk about greetings in Brazil. When communicating or greeting each other, handshake is the most common and appropriate greeting for anyone. Men who are close to each other may pat on their backs with a handshake. Next, direct eye contact is important when communicating, especially for friends in public situations. It is also common to greet with a warm hug. Women usually hug and lightly kiss each other's cheeks when communicating. The ways to give greeting are different depending on the region. As explained earlier, Brazilians tend to be tactile when communicating. Next, I'm going to talk about physical space. Personal space and physical space are not emphasized in Brazil. physical closeness and bumping of occasional bumping of another person is common in Brazil. And it is considered rude if one steps back. Brazilians are more comfortable sharing personal space, so they stand close together and casually touch each other when communicating. Brazilians tend to be very expressive and emotive in their communication. They express themselves with lots of gestures and facial expressions, and they are not afraid to talk about themselves. So they sometimes interrupt others when speaking. However, despite their communication behavior, they tend to avoid conflict, and they sometimes shift the topic they'd like to talk about.
So again, compared to the United States, Brazil, like we talked about before, is more relaxed and more open and expressive. In public settings in the US, Americans like to respect personal space when you don't know someone. So it's very normal that when you first meet an American, they're going to go for a handshake or a head nod instead of a hug or a kiss on the cheek. Secondly, depending on the activity, silence is welcomed in the United States. So it was talked about how silence in Brazil tends to kind of signify something that they don't want. They don't like long silences, but in the United States, silence can sometimes be seen as a sign of productivity. So whether it's someone doing something or studying or working, silence is a lot of times welcomed. Third, Americans use a moderate amount of hand gestures and facial expressions. So I again talked about how handshakes are normal in the United States. And facial expressions can also signify that you're listening and you're comprehending and you're responding to someone. But when it comes to being as emotive and expressive as people are in Brazil, it's not exactly the same. Um, and again, I talked about things that are different in the United States than they are in Brazil. But something that is very similar to Brazil is the fact that conflict is generally avoided in public settings in the United States. So there's a reason that we don't tend to talk about politics or religion in public settings, and it's because we don't like that conflict, and we don't like to essentially disagree with people and cause tension. So that's something that's very similar in the United States. That it is similar. It's very similar in the United States than it is in Brazil.
Next, I'm going to talk about comparison to Japan in public setting. First, physical space is highly valued in Japan. The Japanese have an incredible ability to establish their own physical space in the most crowded conditions. Second, when greeting in Japan, shaking hands is usual and sometimes doing hugs, but not the case. As mentioned above, Japanese people tend to have enough personal space, so they greet not close as Brazil. Finally, it takes much more time to get to know each other by communicating in Japan. Also, when communicating bad news, Japanese people may smile and laugh to diffuse the uncomfortable situation. Okay, that's all. Thank you for listening.